Silent Spring Environmental Influence. The author of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, was born in 1907 in a small rural area near the Allegheny River. She grew up on a farm in the town of Springdale, Pennsylvania, where she gained an interest in nature and also grew a passion for writing early on. She had her first story published in a children's magazine at the age of 10. At the age of 18, Carson began her college education at the Pennsylvania College of Women, where she majored in English. However, she later had a change of heart and switched her degree to biology. During her time, she completed a fellowship with the U.S. Marine Laboratory. She also went on to graduate school at Johns Hopkins University thanks to scholarships she received. Carson began work at the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries as a writer shortly after completing her graduate work. During this time, she also wrote for newspapers and magazines on conservation and nature issues. She later was offered the position of junior aquatic biologist, which was later promoted to aquatic biologist and eventually editor-in-chief at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Some of her books she published include Under the Sea Wind and The Sea Around Us. During her work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, she was exposed to the effects pesticides, DDTs in particular, can have on wildlife and nature. This really started her concern in their issues. Rachel became fully interested in DDTs after her friends sent her a letter informing her of the number of birds being killed in Massachusetts as a result of DDT exposure. She went off of scientific information alone, including reviewing scientific reports and interviewing leaders in the field. She worked with former U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service employees Shirley Briggs and Clarence Cottom in the gathering of this information. The book dives into the reported health effects that pesticides have caused in people and animals. In the book, Carson also calls for action in the allowed use of such dangerous substances. The book she had worked on for several years was finally released in 1962. It first was picked up by the New Yorker in the summer of that year. They published 3 sections in their paper, while the official book came out later in that same year. This was right around the time the environmental era started to get going here in America. Some even credit Carson with the environmental movement. She came under attack from the chemical industry as she was a woman and did not hold a PhD. She was easily written off by many. Eventually, Rachel was investigated by the government. In the introduction chapter, Carson paints a detailed picture of a small town somewhere in America where there are many farms, vegetation, fish, and wildlife that thrive. She then changes the tone by depicting the same town now silent due to an unnamed white substance. There are people, including children, ill and dying, while farm animals, wildlife, and plants suffer the same. Carson uses this chapter to really draw the reader in and make them want to keep going further. The author speaks of pesticides getting into our food and contaminating our water, soil, and air. Potential effects include cancer and death in humans and animals, while plants were killed as well. She also discusses how once they enter the body, they will stay there until death. It is also suggested they are within a baby before its birth and can alter genes. Carson writes of how people are the blame for our soil, water, and air contamination as they try to fight pests. People are blamed for the explosion of insect populations as we provide ideal habitat for them through mass crops and planting of the same species and groups. She encourages people to view nature more carefully and to try and find alternatives to chemicals. Many questions are asked throughout the book that makes the reader question humans-nature relationship. Throughout Silent Spring, Rachel asks the reader questions about why we are allowing these dangerous chemicals around us and why there is nothing being done about it. President John F. Kennedy himself asked that her claims be looked into for truthfulness. After her work was discovered to hold scientific truth, government figures got on board with her work, and there was a report published shortly after supporting Silent Spring. After the government got on board with her findings, new laws passed in 1964 required chemical companies to prove their products were not a real danger before they could be marketed. After this, DDT became banned altogether several years later, and greater restrictions came into place for chemicals of different kinds. Rachel Carson is often credited with inspiring the modern environmental movement through her writing and work. People were moved to re-examine how we interact with nature. She calls for action in the contamination of our water, soil, and air, inspiring the creation of the EPA in 1970.